All right, welcome to the plenary lecture number 2. My name is Yuda Tianto. I'm professor of History of Christianity and Reformed Theology here at Calvin Theological Seminary. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to my good friend, Dr. Mirjam van Veen. Dr. van Veen is professor of church history at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and professor of the history of Anabaptism and related movements at the Mennonite Seminary in Amsterdam. She earned her doctorate in 2001 with a dissertation on the polemic between Dirk Cournert and Johannes Calvin. Since then, her research included the polemics and struggles between religious majorities and religious minorities, and this research has been a thread through many of her publications. She published articles and books on David Joris and Sebastian Castellius' pleas for religious tolerance, wrote about Cournert's flights, his polemic against the preachers and his concern for Dutch freedom, and she also delivered a number of critical editions of texts by Calvin and Castellio. She is currently putting the finishing touches to a book about Uitenhoven's Fidelis Narratio. This is a story of a group of Reformed refugees who sought refuge in Veen in North German Hanseatic cities in 1553. Mirjam has supervised many PhD students on migration history, history of Anabaptism, history of Reformed Protestantism, and history of baptism. Now, she also coordinates the Amsterdam Center for the History and Heritage of Protestantism, ACHHP. I tried to memorize that when I was in the Netherlands last month, and I still failed. So anyways, this is a wonderful center. The center aims to make Amsterdam's unique religious heritage more accessible to both researchers and interested parties. Today, Mirjam will present a paper titled Living in Babylon, Calvin's Correspondence with Believers Living in Exile. Please join me in welcoming Mirjam van Veen.
Thanks, Judah, for your kind introduction. My problem is that after such an introduction, a paper could easily be disappointing, I suppose. But, okay. And thanks for having us here at Calvin. It feels a little bit as coming home, you know? I was one of those many fellows here. One who works on Calvin and the refugees cannot avoid using the work of Heiko Oberman. His work with a clear vision of how Geneva's Reformation became the Reformation of the refugees continues to stamp our research. According to Heiko Oberman, exile, with all his Old Testament connotations, was indeed a hallmark of Calvinist identity. The idea of God's providence and predestination offered comfort to the beleaguered refugees. Refugees themselves fostered a strong in-group mentality and kept their group together by a strong discipline. Oberman emphasized how the Reformation took recourse to the Old Testament exactly because they identified with the Old Testament stories on exile. According to Oberman, the experience of forced migration radically changed the character of the Church of Calvin and his followers. I quote, "Calvin regarded himself as a soldier stationed in Geneva, but at the same time as an officer directing a European army. Calvin ceased to be city-oriented." End quote. Oberman was not alone in emphasizing how exile marked the lives of Reformed communities and Reformed believers. William Bousma, for example, described how exile marked Calvin's life and traced his supposed anxiety back to his exile. Others, such as Ole Pieter Grell, for example, showed how the network of refugees gave Reformed Protestantism an international outlook. Scholars broadened the scope of research on 16th century exiles even further, addressing the social background of these exiles, their contribution to local economies, their international networks and cooperation across boundaries, but also to a comparison between Reformed Lutheran and Catholic migration. Crucial words in today's thinking on early modern migrants are suffering, model churches, commitment, Reformed orthodoxy, and militant Calvinism. I never make PowerPoints, I hope you enjoy it. It looks beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. My own research project on Reformed refugees along the German Rhine, together with Jesse Spoonholz, and my own project on Johannes Utenhove, showed that we have to modify this idea of a reformation of the refugees. Whereas in Lutheran theology, ministers proudly identified as exiles and claimed authority because of their exilic status, Reformed barely wrote treatises on the exile experience. In the mid-16th century, Tertullian's warning against the flight as an act of cowardice still bore a serious bearing on the Reformed. And although Calvin changed the understanding of a flight as an act of cowardice and circumscribed a flight as an act that could be motivated by faith, he was still far away from celebrating exiled churches as model churches or even the purest part of Christ's flock. In his sermons, Calvin made it clear that believers in Geneva were in fact better off than those who still stayed in France. As Christ had been expelled from France, living in France came down to living in Babylon. Thus he equated living in France with living in exile. Calvin was, however, not entirely clear in his terminology. In his dedication of his commentary of the Harmony of Gospels to Frankfurt's City Council, he designated both the strangers in Frankfurt and those who continue to live in their homeland as exiles. In a letter to Valéran Poulain, he explained that all believers were in fact exiles. After a lifelong pilgrimage, they only came home in the afterlife. In a letter to the English exiles in Zurich, Calvin used the old Christian insight to qualify the suffering of these exiles. Sed filius Dei, qui se agnoscunt mundi heredis, exulare non adiudurum est, re ipsa quoque asui firi ut peregrini discant in terra utile est. Many migrants were indeed aware that they were in fact better off than those who stayed at home. They rarely circumscribe themselves as exiles, but often designate themselves as pilgrims. They didn't think of their experience as something special. After all believers were strangers on earth. Pilgrims on the way to the heavenly home. Just like Calvin, some of them wondered whether those living still in France or, for example, in the Low Countries weren't in fact living in exile. Thomas Lever, who had migrated from Marian England to Geneva, described Geneva as his home. His membership in Geneva's church was decisive, as it made him part of the divine household. And indeed, many of the Dutch migrants who went to the Rhine River region succeeded in building a new future over there. The vast majority never returned to the Low Countries because the Rhine River region became their home. After the days of repression and persecution were over, the Reformed in the Dutch Republic indeed became a dominant factor in the religious landscape. Reformed believers continued to memorize the days of persecution, and now and then they glorified those days as the days of steadfast faith. But this memory was not focused on exiles, but on those persecuted in general. It was only in later narratives on the 16th century that people started to ascribe such a crucial role to exiles. The Huguenot Refuge and Abraham Kuyper's vision were crucial steps in the development towards the theology of exile. My aim today, that's a long introduction, my aim today is to move beyond this admittingly pretty deconstructive approach. My paper today will be on Calvin's correspondence with refugee communities, and my aim is to analyze Calvin's role and position vis-à-vis these refugee communities as well as his own theological stand. How did he perceive the role of stranger churches and religious migrants in the Reformed movement? But one who wants to work on Calvin's correspondence with these stranger churches has to resolve an important issue: how to define stranger churches. In fact, the definition of a stranger church is not clear. It is clear that Frankfurt harbored several stranger churches, and the same goes for London. But what about Wesel? We count this church among the stranger churches, but its ecclesiastical structures were integrated in the local church. In that sense, this church was to some extent comparable to the church of, for example, Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier. In 1562, a significant group of Reformed strangers from Flanders came to Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, causing some unrest because of their different habits. Nevertheless, this church is never counted as a stranger church. Maybe because these strangers from Flanders lacked an organizational structure altogether, whereas in Wesel, being part of the local church, also had their own organizational structure. That's me. They organized their own social welfare and their own church discipline. Metz is another example of the ambiguity of the term stranger church. Petrus Colonius, a stranger from the Low Countries, ministered this church, and several other strangers from the Low Countries joined this church as well. Nevertheless, historians don't count this church among the stranger churches. The observation that it is barely possible to determine what constituted a stranger church is significant. It raises the question of the extent to which it's possible to treat stranger churches as a distinct group at all. And indeed, Calvin's correspondence with ministers in France closely resembles his correspondence with ministers of stranger churches. And this prompts the question of the extent to which, for Calvin, strangers were a distinct group at all. We counted churches among stranger churches if a group of strangers had their own organizational structure. This means that we count Wesel among the stranger churches. For all those strangers in Wesel participated in the local church, they had their own disciplinary and social system. It is important, however, to keep in mind that the boundaries between a normal church and a stranger church were indeed fluid. The number of Calvin's letters to stranger communities is limited. In the Calvini Opera, we counted some 20 letters to the consistories of stranger churches or to the communities as a whole. These letters were, as a rule, written in French. Beside these letters to communities and consistories, Calvin wrote letters to individuals, especially to ministers. And these letters were, as a rule, written in Latin. He exchanged letters with, for example, Guillaume Aubrac, who kept him abreast of Strasbourg's stranger church, and with Nicolas Decalard, who updated him on London's stranger church. These letters to ministers are far more numerous than Calvin's letters to communities, and they show once again how important ministers were in spreading the Reformed gospel. The backbone of the network of Reformed churches, including the stranger churches, was formed by ministers and not the consistories. In the case of Frankfurt, these letters to the community and to ministers were narrowly intertwined. In the mid-50s, Frankfurt's stranger community plunged itself into a whole sequence of polemics, strifes, disruptions, and struggles. Calvin used the correspondence with ministers, magistrates, and the community to obtain information from various sides and to urge the strangers in Frankfurt to search for peace and unity. In doing so, Calvin probably attached more value to the information of one letter writer than to that of the other. Anyone who reads Calvin's correspondence with various people in Frankfurt will see clear differences in position. Poulain addressed Calvin with the title Father in Christ, Claubourg with Master and Friend. In fact, Calvin adopted Claubourg's view of events in Frankfurt. In the case of Strasbourg and London, Calvin exchanged letters with ministers serving the congregation. Between the letters to stranger communities on the one hand and the letters to ministers on the other hand, there are differences. These differences concern not only the language, but also the tone of the letters. The letters to the communities are distinctly pious in tone and generally have a beginning reminding one of the Apostle Paul's letters. La dilection de Dieu notre Pierre et la grâce de notre Seigneur Jésus-Christ soit toujours sur vous par la communication du Saint-Esprit. Then the letters often call for unity and fidelity to the true Reformed faith. Almost without exception, these letters address the brethren in the congregation. Only in one letter to the elders and deacons of Frankfurt, Calvin also addresses the sisters of the congregation. Calvin's correspondence with the ministers is more down to earth. These ministers inform Calvin on the well-being of their flock, on issues with local magistrates, and on doctrinal issues in their community. Beside that, Calvin exchanged news with these ministers on what happened with the larger Reformed movement. They informed each other on what happened in other countries, on the well-being of other churches, and on the well-being of mutual friends and colleagues. This correspondence with ministers were not purely business. Calvin and these ministers were part of a large international community of Reformed theologians, and in their letters they greeted other theologians who were in Geneva, London, or Strasbourg at the same time, and they exchanged personal news as well. Especially in the correspondence with Degalard, this personal element plays a major role. Degalard regularly wrote to Calvin about the well-being of his wife and children, and just like the letters to these communities, these letters often end with a blessing. The letters were imbued with a sense of being part of a large Christian community. Stranger communities called on Calvin for help. They sought his theological advice, begged for his spiritual support, and tried to use Calvin's authority as a spiritual leader to settle disputes. John Knox and William Whittingham, for example, hoped that Calvin's authority would add weight to their own arguments. Alasco hoped Calvin could convince the Pilgrims' Church to be united. Others asked Calvin to pray for them or to provide them with theological insights. Pierre Alexander hoped that Calvin would strengthen the weak workers in Strasbourg vineyard by his counsel and prayer. The main reason, however, for appealing to Calvin were conflicts. One striking characteristic that these churches had in common was their total lack of stability. Churches were constantly negotiating their position with local governments, were constantly dealing with heretical ideas that threatened pure doctrine, and were constantly uncertain about the design of their own organization. And they were constantly in conflict among themselves about leadership, proper doctrine, discipline, and the proper use of ceremonies. The leadership of these stranger communities was always under pressure. The method of electing ministers was still subject to debate, and ministers often stayed only a few years and then moved on. Thus, the situation in the stranger church was less stable than in churches where ministers stayed for decades. Mobility of church members was also high. This was sometimes accompanied by problems. The arrival of a new group of believers with again their own habits and views could easily upset the shaky balance in a congregation. The mobility of large groups of believers could easily add to the uncertainty about proper doctrine, proper liturgical habits, and a proper church order. For newcomers often brought different ideas and habits with them. Moreover, the influx of new church members could make it difficult to know one's own members and be sure that no dissenting elements were entering the congregation. In Frankfurt, dissenting influences in the congregation put additional pressure on the relationship with the government. The congregation thus had a major problem. Especially in the context of Frankfurt, it was of great importance to keep dissenters out. But especially in the context of Frankfurt, with this permanent influx of newcomers, this was difficult. In that specific context of uncertainty, stranger churches asked Calvin for practical advice and spiritual counsel. Calvin's role in this minefield was unclear. For some ministers in refugee congregations, Calvin was a spiritual father whose pupils they themselves were. Others regarded Calvin more as their equal, but very much like Bullinger, for example. Calvin and his church in Geneva fulfilled a special role within the Reform movement in the eyes of the refugees. They appealed to his scholarship and his piety. Alasco regretted that his poor health prevented him from traveling to Geneva to see Calvin and his church in person. Formally, however, Calvin had no power, and stranger churches or ministers could easily disregard his advice. Even Jean Carnier, who repeatedly assured Calvin that he considered himself as a faithful disciple of his father in Christ, ignored Calvin's advice to sign the Confessio Augustana. In fact, refugee communities were not ready to take Calvin's insights for granted, but rather made their own decisions. Wesel, for example, listened to Calvin's advice, but not without first consulting others and weighing the various opinions. In Frankfurt, Calvin's calls for moderation fell on deaf ears, and some of the strangers accused him of exceeding the boundaries of authority and complained about Calvin's tyranny. Calvin was well aware of his informal and limited role. In the case of Emden, for example, he explained that he hadn't written to them as vous avez un homme qui tâche de vous enseigner fidèlement. And Calvin was cautious in giving advice. When in Strasbourg Pierre Alexander and Guillaume Aubrac clashed in a debate, Calvin refused to intervene. And this incident illustrates Calvin's awkward position. Strangers now and then expected all sorts of things from Calvin, but Calvin's own information was colored and fragmented. Aubrac and Alexander, at least, had different readings of this incident. In a letter to Peroussel on how to comport in Wesel, Calvin explained that he had little knowledge of the local context. Quare nihil praescribo. He also responded careful to Jean Loquet's request for advice. Calvin referred him to familie, since he also lived in Strasbourg, and he was probably in a better position to give him advice. Added to this was the fact that given the unreliable postal system of the 16th century, Calvin sometimes did not receive requests for help, or received them only with long delays. Not having all the information, Calvin sometimes misjudged the situation. In the case of Strasbourg, for example, Calvin made a miscalculation in sending his own refutation of Westphal. He misjudged the field of forces between Lutherans and Reformed and his own position in the city. In addition to a lack of information, a lack of formal authority played a role. Letter writers sometimes gave Calvin great credit, but he had no formal position. Calvin himself addressed his adversaries as brethren, and he was aware that he had no means other than persuasion. He used these to explain doctrine to the congregation and pastors, urged for allegiance to the Reformed faith and call for moderation. And in the case of Frankfurt, he also tried to influence the magistrate. He dedicated its gospel harmony to the Senate and wrote to Adolf and Johann Glauburg. Hence, Calvin's role and authority in the stranger churches was limited. Stranger churches and migrants valued his advice, his prayers, his knowledge of proper doctrine, and now and then his spiritual guidance. However, it is questionable whether his influence was greater than that of, say, Bullinger. It is known of the Dutch stranger church in London that its leaders primarily oriented themselves to Zurich. It would be worthwhile to compare Calvin's and Bullinger's correspondence with the refugee churches and to see whether Calvin's correspondence was really special. Obermann's description of the refugee communities in London, Antwerp, and Andem as 3 examples where Calvin's vision became reality, and as in Andem where in the church records, I quote, Calvin's signature is readily discernible, page after page, exaggerates Calvin's influence. He barely exchanged letters with these communities, and stranger communities didn't rely on Calvin as their only unique leader. The letters Calvin exchanged with ministers in stranger communities are very comparable to the letters he exchanged with other ministers. The goals Calvin presumably pursued with this correspondence was also similar to those in his other correspondences. In his correspondence, he exchanged news, exchanged views with his correspondents, and sought to maintain contact. Letters serve to relay political news, ecclesiastical and religious news, and personal news. Therefore, the letters Calvin exchanged with correspondents were not purely personal. For example, Slijdanus also read the letter Calvin had written to Bullinger about the unrest in Geneva. Members of the correspondence network also alerted each other to the publication of books. For example, as soon as Joachim Westphal had written something again, Calvin received word from various quarters that his opponent had written something again. In the exchange of views, Calvin was most clearly active as a teacher who explained to his correspondents the doctrine of baptism and the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Yet even there was no one-way traffic. Although Calvin explained to the English exiles the ceremonies, some of the exiles simply continued to disagree with him. The main purpose of the correspondence was presumably to maintain the brotherhood. As mentioned earlier, women were conspicuously absent from Calvin's correspondence with the foreign churches, even in the letters he addressed to the entire refugee communities in a given place. Correspondents always ended their letters with a wish of blessing and greetings from people around them to the circle of people around the recipient. The letter writers were also interested in personal ups and downs. In the 1560s, Calvin's health became a topic of the correspondence, and his correspondents invariably wished him an improvement of his health. But Calvin also had an eye for how his addressees were doing. De Calair's concerns about his wife and his longing for his wife, when he was already in London but his wife was not yet, were subjects of the conversation. When Richard Vauville's wife died, Calvin wrote him a letter recalling his own grief over the death of his own wife and encouraging his addressee to entrust himself to God's providence. In the epistles, the theme of exile or alienation only occasionally comes up briefly. Terms then used are, as indicated earlier, exile, pilgrimage, and the scattered church on earth. Occasionally, Calvin writes a sentence or two about the harshness of exile. However, it is rarely a theme. The comfort he seeks to offer to, for example, the strangers in Zurich is similar to the comfort he seeks to offer to all believers. Believers should stand firm and bear their cross patiently. Christ reigns under the cross and will be victorious despite the reproach of the world that believers now bear. Calvin therefore did not attribute to exiles or stranger churches a specific role in the Reformed movement. Calvin's view was, of course, closely related to the great influence on him of Augustine's awareness that a person was a stranger in this world. Forced migration recalled that awareness and was an exercise in this teaching. The idea that Calvin would have espoused a theology of exile with a strong radical commitment to the Reformed confession and clearly defined boundaries is not substantiated in his correspondence. Rather, quite the opposite. Many more strongly than in his letters to the congregations in France, Calvin insists on compromise and adaptation. And this is related to the context in which many refugee congregations operated, because many stranger churches lived in Lutheran lands. And as a result, they had to reflect on what was acceptable and what was not. Reformed differed among themselves on how pure liturgical ceremonies should be. The theological question was one thing, the practical question another. On many occasions, Reformed didn't have a free choice to accept Lutheran ceremonies or not. The decision to insist on liturgical purity could result in the closure of their church or their expulsion. To many stranger churches, the question on whether or not to participate in Lutheran ceremonies became a thorny issue. They had to navigate between their own desire for ritual purity and international Reformed liturgical unity on the one hand, and Lutheran request for unity and respect for hospitality on the other hand. Calvin was well aware of the specific context in which these stranger churches operated. Mais il nous semble que votre condition est diverse de celle des pasteurs du lieu et de tout le corps du peuple. The fact that the Reformed strangers were a minority was, according to Calvin, a legitimate reason to accommodate to the Lutheran majority. For the exiles, according to Calvin, unity was of great importance, and this called for flexibility. In a letter to the English congregation in Frankfurt, he argued that the rituals belonged to the middle things. In his letter, Calvin described the Anglican liturgy as tolerabilis ineptias. This is to check your Latin. Circumstances sometimes made it necessary to moderate the pursuit of purity. The need to compromise and be flexible played out not only in church rituals, but also, for example, in the appointment of a minister. Calvin, in a letter to Frankfurt, readily admitted that Valéran Poulain had not been lawfully called. But given the particular circumstances in which the French church at Frankfurt had begun and was still in, Calvin felt it was wrong to insist on the rules surrounding the calling of a minister. Ceux qui maintiennent telles causes sont mal advisés, tenant une rigueur trop extrême, et qui est nullement à l'édification de l'Église. Of course, there were limits to compromise. One could compromise on rituals, according to Calvin, but not on doctrine. When it came to ceremony, however, Calvin argued that it was the duty of believers to try to accommodate one another. In short, Calvin's correspondence with refugee communities was modest in scope. More numerous than his letters to communities are his letters to ministers. However, this correspondence with ministers of stranger communities differs in little respect from the correspondence with ministers in France. Most of these letters he wrote during the second sacramental controversy to stranger churches and led ministers in Lutheran territory. Calvin had authority in these stranger churches, but that authority was informal and depended on those who granted it. He was to stranger churches and their ministers the ministers of Geneva, a learned theologian, a person who could give counsel based on his great piety. Stranger churches and their ministers felt free to ask others for counsel as well, or to ignore Calvin's advice. Calvin attributed no special role to exile communities. Migrants were pilgrims, exiles, like other believers on their way to the heavenly homeland. The way the modern literature emphasizes the suffering of the exiles might be at odds with the early modern perspective. Only occasionally in his letters, Calvin does dwell on the suffering engendered by forced migration. Much stronger is the sense that all people are strangers in this world. And in fact, depending on where they came from and where they ended up, many migrants were, of course, also better off than those who stayed at home. This was true economically, but also spiritually. More than once, Calvin referred to France as Babylon. And after all, Christ had been expelled from France. And refugees from the Low Countries similarly referred to the Low Countries as Babylon. The attitude promoted by Calvin in his letters by no means confirms the idea that a militant kind of Calvinism arose in exile communities. It was important for these strangers to patiently bear the suffering of forced migration and of constant persecution from the church. The virtue of patience, moderation, naturally suited the attitude to life promoted by the early modern era. But these virtues were also almost necessary for survival in the context in which the 16th century refugees found themselves. In the concrete context in which they lived, a minority dependent on the hospitality of a Lutheran majority, flexibility and adaptability were important. Unlike in his letters to the communities in France in which Calvin insists on purity and steadfastness in the face of idolatry, Calvin, in his letters to exile communities, reiterates again and again the virtue of moderation. The only means of remaining united and the only means of survival as a small minority in a foreign land. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mirjam, for your paper. Now it's time for us for question and answer. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself. Tell us your name. Here, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Bruce Gordon. This idea of sort of adaptation in leadership in a community and of compromise, which Calvin counsels to others. Is this something that you see that he embodies himself in his own way of dealing with communities? Is this advice for others, or do you see it as something that actually, out of the correspondence, extends and perhaps even reflects his own experience of working within a refugee community?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Bruce. I do indeed think that this is what he emphasizes in his letters to stranger communities. So I think that there is indeed a difference between his letters to these exile communities and these communities in France. And that, for example, in his letters to that community in Frankfurt, he really tries to urge them to moderate themselves and to accommodate themselves. And when Frankfurt's church closes, he also thinks that those refugees are to blame for that, and that it is in fact their own mistake because they have been too insistent, have been ungrateful, and because their own conflicts among themselves. Also, that's also a point. So he indeed thinks that it is a duty of those refugees to adopt themselves as far as possible. And I think that really marks also a difference with, for example, Alaska. Alaska insists on the purity of liturgical rituals more than Calvin does. But I think that his correspondence with those stranger communities indeed shows a more moderate side of Calvin's policy. Yeah, I would say so.
Hi, Christine Coy, Louisiana State University. Mirjam, thank you for your talk. I wonder if you would be willing to elaborate a little bit more on that word pilgrim and how Calvin uses it in the correspondence you've looked at, or what you think he means by it. Is there a nuance there that is different from, say, exile or refugee? So if you could just elaborate a little bit more about what you think Calvin
about the distinction between pilgrims and exiles, and yeah, that's a difficult question and a good question as well. But I still struggle, to be honest. So what strikes me is that those strangers from the Low Countries designate themselves as pilgrims. I rarely find the term exile in writings of Micron, Utenhove, etc., and I read them all. But those English exiles identifies themselves more often as exiles. So I wonder whether there was a sort of difference between, for example, England and the Low Countries in that respect. And Calvin just uses those terms simultaneously, but I think that it matters because, for example, Utenhove uses the term pilgrim to claim hospitality. So he refers to medieval law, whereas you are obliged to house pilgrims and to offer them also some food, etc. And he recalls to that obligation to blame Lutherans for not showing hospitality. So I do think that terminology really matters. But as I said, I still struggle to understand those differences. And another difference might be that you might be a pilgrim by choice. And an exile was expelled, so that was sort of forced migration. That is also a distinction I think that matters. So in Dutch writings, I also found back that exiles were more close to criminals because it was a punishment, and that they didn't want to identify as exiles. So I still struggle to understand those early modern nuances, and I'm not sure how to answer your question, but I do think that it matters.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Hines. I really enjoyed the talk. I was curious, when you're looking at the correspondence network, did you find that people were passing along the letters from Calvin, say, to relatives in other exile communities, that his words were getting spread around in a secondary market?
Yes, they did. So as I said, I found that this letter to Boelinger was passed on to others as well. That's just one example, but they passed it on. So now and then these letters were semi-public. And I think that he was well aware of that.
Yeah, how would it affect the way that he was communicating with these different communities?
I didn't investigate that in this occasion when reading letters to refugee communities, but in the case of Regensburg, that colloquium, I looked at his letters, and in letters that were semi-public, he didn't provide all the information, and he did his utmost to show Reformed unity instead of all their debates and the uncertainty about a proper answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Kyung-Phil Kim, I'm a PhD from Calvin Seminary, and I wonder if there is any relevance between Calvin's correspondence with the stranger churches and with the exiles, himself being a refugee as well. You said he emphasizes the necessity of accommodation, and I think that kind of rings a bell to his doctrine of accommodation. Would there be any relevance to from his experience as a refugee to doctrine of accommodation? Because there is this distinction between our theology as a theology of the wayfarer and the theology of blessed.
Yeah, but I would say that's also sort of divine accommodation to humankind. And what I mean is that it's also all the awareness of what it means to be a guest and to adopt to local circumstances. So it's, I think, more down to earth. That's what I would say. It is about how people relate. Is that an answer to your question?
Ken Wu. Thanks so much, Mirjam, for this fantastic presentation. I was curious and intrigued by what you noted as sort of, not only did Calvin not go out of his way to highlight, to lift up the status of these exilic churches as exilic, but even expressed the kind of exasperation in some cases, right, towards the behavior of refugees. It makes you think about how in what we talked about this morning with his theology, he would use occasions of political exile in Scripture to then reflect on spiritual exile as something that he then would apply broadly, whether somebody actually migrated or not. And I wonder, just again, how prevalent is that sort of exasperation as you sort of read through these different examples of correspondence with the stranger churches? It makes you think of Corinne's question earlier, whether this was a pastoral issue in Geneva where he was frustrated with those who came and were causing trouble, maybe using their exile status as a way to differentiate themselves in ways that he tried to correct. Did you see sort of a recurrence of this sort of exasperation with stranger churches or exiles in particular?
Yeah, thanks for that question. What we should do, I now and then think, is to compare these different exile churches and also to compare situation in Geneva with situation elsewhere. And to compare, for example, Dutch, English exile churches, etc., and the replies of Calvin to that very concrete situation. And also to look carefully at development of his views. So Scott Mannis talked about in our session on Beza. And I think that it might differ from Calvin's view. But what we did, I think, so far is to create a very straightforward narrative on how Calvin understood exile, on how he created a sort of theology of exile. Also, we created, I think, a story on the suffering of exiles. And now and then this certainly applies to certain groups of exiles, but on other occasions, I would say it's nonsense. So, for example, Dirk Volkenszoon Kornhert, you mentioned him this morning, went to the German Rhineland, and he was quite happy there. He compared his own stay over there with Horatius' Beatus Ille. So he was quite happy over there because Holland, his home country, was inundated, suffering from economic decline, suffering from warfare, and he was able to ride over there in his refuge and to work over there. He had friends surrounding him, and nothing wrong with that. He was better off than those staying at home. And that might have been different for Theodore de Beze, I don't know, but I think that we have to differentiate between all those stories and also to pay attention to a possible development. Because I think that in the mid-16th century, Tertullian's warning against the flight was indeed still forceful. It was an act of cowardice. That was where they came from.
Amy Burnett, thank you very much, Mirjam, for a fascinating paper. And I would pick up something that you said about how you don't see a lot of difference between his letters to refugee pastors versus other pastors that he's writing to. And I'm wondering about the personal relationships. How many of these men had he actually met? How well did he know them? Can you see a sort of evolution in time over their friendships? And it is perhaps the more important factor, not what kind of church they're pastoring, but how well they actually knew each other.
Yeah, that's also an issue. That's also why I compared the start and the end of those letters, where you can also have a first impression of the relationship between these correspondents. But it is important, I think, yeah. That's also a thing I should do. Yeah, that's true.
Thank you very much, Mirjam, for your lecture. You said Obermann was exaggerating in his book about Geneva, city of refugees. Now it's Obermann, and exaggerating belongs a little bit to his character, but as we have known him. But I was thinking, listening to you, is there not a kind of you said it also, a difference between the exile situation in France as something for the time being, in the hope that France would become a Calvinistic, whatever it should be, country, and then the situation in all kinds of other European cities where he was not good informed and maybe a little bit more modest, and maybe also a little bit afraid that he could give wrong advices also that could give problems with some governments in that cities. He needed maybe also in the French situation. You never know. So, are there also examples of people in these exile churches that expected too much from Calvin, or were disappointed because he was a little bit less strict than he was to his French to the French churches? Is there that the difference that maybe it struck me that you made that difference a little bit.
I don't know if they were really disappointed. So maybe Alaska was, but they didn't see him as the one and only authority. So they also felt free to ignore his advice and to seek the advice of somebody else. Yeah. Yeah, but I wouldn't describe that as disappointment. No, that's right. That's right.
Victor Shepard from Toronto. We're all aware of Lutheran doctrine where Calvin would never urge moderation or compromise or adaptation. But with respect to the stranger churches in a Lutheran context, what Lutheran practices or Lutheran liturgical practices would Calvin say it was safe to compromise on?
Well, for example, the use of candles, baptizing a child in a Lutheran church, even when it included an exorcism. So these kind of things, the use of liturgical vestments, well, those kind of things. Well, I would question whether the decision to go into foreign lands was really a sign of commitment. I think that quite a lot of people left for economic or political reasons, or that it was often a mix of motives which drove them abroad. So I wouldn't equate the decision to migrate with commitment. And as a matter of fact, I also found a letter of Dutch believers who blamed ministers going abroad and asked them, is Christ only preached in safe regions? And they saw staying as an act of commitment. So I think that's really part of that straightforward story. Exile is a sign of commitment. These are committed believers, so they will stand firm and propagate a purified, reformed faith. But there are so many who left also for economic reasons. And for example, Cologne harbored a large Dutch Reformed community. And why did they go to Cologne? Cologne was Catholic once again. So they had to accommodate to a Catholic environment. But they chose Cologne because it offered them better economic perspectives. They were also merchants, so yeah.
Hi, Jenny Smith. I'm just curious, do you have any sense of what the lag time would have been between this correspondence, like a matter of weeks or months, or how long it took for these letters to go back and forth? And would that have affected anything, like by the time they got Calvin's advice, would it have been outdated if big changes had happened, or did the lag time seem to affect kind of the pace of reform?
It depended on where they were. So there was a sort of a postal system, and now and then, if they were fast, they could go from, for example, The Hague to Italy within 14 days. But on another occasion, it took them months. It depended also on the availability of someone who carried the letters with them, and it also depended on place. So I'm also working on a fascinating correspondence of 4 sisters that went into the German Rhineland region, and they deliberately choose a place with a postal system where they could receive letters from their family back home, etc. There is not a sort of general rule on how long it took to deliver those letters.
Last question here.
Kalle Elonheimo. I come back to this moderation, adaptation, accommodation. Would it be fair to say that Calvin would have liked to see in one place always one church of Reformation, but when needed in different languages? So when they came, for example, French-speaking refugees to Frankfurt, or you said that, for example, many Lutheran manners were accepted by Calvin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that played a role in his urge for moderation, that he wanted to maintain that Reformed Church. And it was also a sort of pragmatism, I would say, yeah. And he also makes it quite explicit now and then, that because they are living in foreign lands, they should simply accommodate, whereas people not living in foreign lands are not allowed to accommodate. Or where his advice would be otherwise. Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Mirjam. Let's again, thank you.